And in that process, I insert best practices. Take this example. I was doing a project way back in the state of Punjab to do 500 bus stands. So we did an environmental assessment for a bus stand and developed a template that if I were to build a bus stand, this is what exactly I would do. And I would have a particular type of configuration, layouts, amenities, handling of waste and emissions, emergency situations, and that prescription was replicated to 500 bus stands. So if I were to build a bus stand, this is how it would be. But then for a bus stand, some localization, some context was there, which was brought in, but 80% was templatized. And we call this as a programmatic environmental assessment approach. We will keep this in mind as we move beyond now, slowly, towards our coastal road project. So let's come to the urban context now. In the city, we'll always see a number of projects at a time, in a staggered way, over a period of time, but a number of things happening. So for Mumbai's infrastructure, coastal road is one of such big projects, but there are many things happening. There's a Trans-Harbour Link project being talked about as example. Now, once we escalate our understanding now beyond the project, we would then realize that the project limited environmental assessment is not a good idea. It's a siloed approach. There are going to be cracks where we will miss the bus. You will see just looking at the coastal road project in isolation is not going to be right. I got to look at the whole context in an area-wide basis. And it becomes so critical then that I must emphasize generation and analysis of alternatives. Alternatives become extremely important when we talk about a catchment. And a regional level environmental assessment becomes important, which addresses the cumulative indirect impacts and induced impacts. So my canvas has to be much broader. I got to go beyond the siloed thinking of project EIAs. So it's really worthless to discuss coastal road EIA project in isolation for this city. Won't you agree? Are you with me? You agree? Yes. Next. Let's go back to the school. This slide is just for us to recapitulate what do we mean by these two terms, impact and risk. We sometimes use them interchangeably. Obviously, they are different. And when we say impact, it's a change. It could be positive, negative, or neutral. And we understand it in terms of its extent, that means area of influence, and the magnitude. When we say risk, it is a probability of that impact. And we will then use the word likely magnitude. And we must, in this expression, understand scenarios. Scenarios become very important. And for example, consequences are understood by even very important attributes like climate change. I presume you all have read the EIA of the Coastal Road Project. Have you searched that document for the word climate change? It's important for us to know. The Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change has given the environmental clearance with no climate change consideration in this project, right? So we just note this point as we go in. Next one. Then there is impact typology. So we have a project, and that leads to some direct impacts, and it also has an indirect impact component. If you have many projects, then we have a case of cumulative impacts. And then if you go beyond, then we have the induced impact circles around these cumulative impacts. So you have cumulative impact, yeah, keep pressing, you have induced impacts, and the circle widens. Now, this concept is important. We are now realizing that many times we limit to direct impacts, most of the EAs, seldom on indirect, and very few on cumulatives, and indeed very less when it comes to induced impacts. And in the urban context of projects of such a category like coastal roads, we really need to be very clear on all these typologies of impact. How are we addressing? So we got to elevate our project-limited thinking to a higher level of a framework, an environmental social management framework. And that becomes relevant when we talk about area-wide development projects. Now this visual is very important. I would like to spend a minute at least on this. What you see in the x-axis of this diagram is that typology of impact we talked, right? Direct impacts, indirect impacts, induced impacts. And what you see on the y-axis is the area of influence. And if I have categories of A, B, C, and A being most sensitive from environmental social point of view, and C the least sensitive, and B is in between, moderate, you will see these zones in the diagram which show you that a project EIA is very limited, and the environmental social management framework is going across. And coastal road project like category A has all of these types of impacts, direct and indirect and induced, and the area of influence also is large. The footprint is also large. And the way that I would intervene those ENS issues, on the top if you see, I would, in the normal case of a project EIA, limit to project-specific mitigations. So I will have a road project, I'll build a noise barrier, as an example. But then if I am in a case of a zone for a category B project, means more sensitive than category C, then I must have a good plan in place. I must look at cumulative and regional EIA. I can also look at programmatic approach in managing those ENS issues. And in the case of category A, I got to look at not just the plan, but policies, and bring in the instruments of strategic EIA. The coastal road project EIA today, the way it has been done, is a project level EIA. But the kinds of issues which we have merit a strategic level EIA. So we have to keep this in mind, that the treatment of environmental assessment has been right now limited to the project only. We revisit my first slide, that we're looking at projects for the interests of society, for development, for quality of life. And there is something, we use the term development effectiveness of what we do. So if you look at the development effectiveness and the different instruments, project EIA is often, if let alone in the urban context, you'd find that the effectiveness on a short time is good, but over a period of time, it has a high chance of falling. On the other hand, if you can go back, on the other hand, if you look at the ESMF extension, that is going beyond the project EIA and developing a umbrella framework, then there's a higher chance that your development effectiveness in fact improves, because you have a much more holistic and comprehensive approach where you're not doing only project limited thinking, but you are looking at in a regional development context, and that makes the difference. So there is indeed a need. So I'm making an argument here that there is a need. that you have to look at environmental social management frameworks where the project EIAs are embedded in that framework. So they are subset of the overall framework. That's the way that we have to go. And what does this framework do? It sets out policy and principles across the projects. These frameworks address cumulative, indirect, and induced impacts. They integrate environmental and social aspects in the project cycle. Most importantly, they emphasize generation and analysis of alternatives. They focus on avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of both impacts and risks. They recommend building of institutional capacity for delivery. And they have a monitoring component which comes up with required adaptation. And most importantly, they are all driven through stakeholders, their involvement, and reporting and disclosure are given paramount importance. So that's the whole advantage of setting out a framework. So an ESMF has 4 P's around. It's going beyond the project. It's looking at the plan. It is looking at the program and the policy, and involves regulators, investors, and partners, the other stakeholders, and emphasizes building the institutional capacity. So ESMF is a central position there. A typical ESMF has its policy, guiding and operational principles, and then a structure which looks at identifying the risks, screening and categorization, which we talked about, then controlling and managing these risks, integrating them in the business process, monitoring, adaptation, and reporting, all the way through stakeholder engagement, external audits on the performance, the management review, training capacity building, and document control and update. So it's a rigorous framework which goes through all projects which are governed by the ESPF or ESMF. Next. This is an illustration that right from pre-feasibility studies, feasibility, project design, implementation, completion, operations, you'll have several entry points of environmental and social management which will keep on adapting the project, its concept, its design, alternatives, so that what you get at the end of it is something which is acceptable. Somewhere you can see it will strike a compromise. Somewhere there would be hybrid solutions, and that is